Hello, everyone. This is the 238th episode of Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I welcome back Peruvian journalist Mr. Daniel Arce as we discuss the Peru national team during the 1982 World Cup. Welcome back, Daniel.
Hello, Shahan. It's always a pleasure to share with you and your kind audience. I will be very happy and excited to talk about all the topics you need to discuss.
So let's go back in time. Last time we left off with Peru at the end of the 1978 World Cup. Can you describe the state of the affairs in Peruvian football post 1978, coming near 1982?
As we were discussing some time ago about the 1978 process, remember that Argentina won the World Cup. That meant that Argentina was automatically classified for the 1982 World Cup. That meant a shorter schedule for South American teams on the verge and looking for qualifying for the 1982 World Cup. So there were nine teams this time, and they were divided in three groups with three associations each, right? And the champion of each group, the first place of each of these three groups, would obtain a direct qualification for the World Cup. It was a very simple scheme with home and visitors games. So, as I was mentioning, there were nine teams. Of course, Peru was taking part of this team. Peru was placed in the second group along with Uruguay and Colombia. There was a lot of expectation because despite of having an okay World Cup in 1978, the expectations were very high for the Peruvian team because of the arrival of Brazilian coach Elba de Padua team. He had experience coaching in Peruvian teams, and there was a high expectation for him to do well and an acceptable campaign for the 1982 qualification. And Peru was seated in the group two with Uruguay and Colombia, right? So, yes, that's my first thought, right? Three teams per group, Peru along with Uruguay and Colombia. Big expectations because Peru had a very, very, very good team with a lot of stars. We're talking about César Cueto, Guillermo La Rosa, Julio César Uribe, Juan Carlos Oblitas, Jerónimo Barbadillo. We're talking about players with one World Cup or even two World Cups on their backs. So the expectations were very high for this process.
As you mentioned, some of the big names. At that point, Teofilo Cubillas was the sole remnant of 1970. Of course, had been 1978 as well. While others, like the names you mentioned, Jaime Duarte, Herman Leguia, Jose Velasquez, Cesar Cueto, Oblitas, Ruben Toribio Diaz, Guillermo La Rosa, Percy Rojas, and Ramon Quiroga had been part of the 1978 World Cup squad. So it's a experienced side. What can you say about this core of veterans that were still key parts of the team?
So there were a lot of critics, both positive and negative, toward the pick and the final roster decided for the World Cup by this Brazilian coach Elba de Padua team, right? They even call Peru the dream team of South America because you need to remember, Shahan, that this meant a second qualification in a row for Peru. And we were talking about big names, just as you were mentioning, Ruben Diaz, fullback who used to play along with Héctor Chumpitas on the previous World Cups. He had a lot on his back. We're talking also about Julio César Uribe, Juan Carlos Oblitas, Teófilo Cubillas, despite of not playing in Europe at the time and sometimes resisted by the public and the public opinion and the fans because they considered that maybe his time at Peru's national team was not necessarily strategic for the team to have him instead of Julio César Uribe, which was the other player with the same characteristic, with the same style of play than Cubillas. So, yeah, there was a lot of critiques, both positive and both negatives. Let's remember that the qualification for Peru was practically perfect, right? They played 4 matches. They were completely invicta with no losses, 2 wins, 2 draws, and that meant the qualification. Ramon Quiroga, as you were mentioning, it was the goalkeeper. The defense were more like Rubén Díaz, Jaime Duarte, Jorge Olechea, and Salvador Salguero. The midfielders were José Velázquez, that remember he was in the previous World Cups, César Cueto, Julio César Uribe, Teófilo Cubillas. And for forwards, they had one of the most lethal attacks in South America, consisting in Guillermo La Rosa, Franco Navarro, Juan Carlos Oblitas, Jerónimo Barbadillo, and Germán Leguía. So, what I'm trying to encapsulate here is that we were talking about a team full of stars. Sometimes when you have a lot of different egos and personalities trying to work together in a team, you have the two sides of the story. It can go very well and it can go very bad.
And you already mentioned him a few times, the Brazilian manager Elba de Padua Lima, nicknamed Tim. Just like Didi in 1970, Peru had hired a Brazilian manager. And Tim was a veteran of the 1938 World Cup squad of Brazil. Let's discuss his trajectory and how he differed tactically from his predecessor from 1978, Marcos Calderon Medrano.
As I was mentioning, Elba de Padua Lima, more known as Tim, had a very high and very important vision of football. Himself was a footballer back in the days. He's become idol of Fluminense and Botafogo, two teams from Brazil with a lot of history. So, as a coach, he mostly directed Brazilian and Argentinian teams before arriving to Peru. So he had probably not as the same experience as his predecessors, Marcos Calderon or Didi, with the local atmosphere and local environment, with the Peruvian Football Association or with the players itself. But qualifying directly to the World Cup gave him a higher standard and legitimacy, towards the national team. And let's remember, Shahan, that after qualifying for the World Cup, there was a previous tour that was directed by Elba de Padua Lima. They went on a European tour playing against France and other teams. And the coach, Elba de Padua Lima, was planning on Europe to scout some of the teams that were going to play against Peru, like the case of Italy and Poland. So there was this friendly in Spain between Italy and Poland, and the coach attended this match to see the state of affairs of these two teams and probably planify and look forward the upcoming matches, right? One thing that was very criticized is that the press in Peru, the national press, were concerned about Cameroon because it was an unknown at the time team. They were no much of a register or an idea of their play style or their teamwork. And unfortunately, Elba de Padua Lima didn't focus on Cameroon and he only focused on Italy and Poland, so it was criticized at the time.
Yes, and the friendly you're mentioning between Poland and Italy, it was actually Poland and like an Inter AC Milan 11, because Poland went on tour of Italy. And also remember, let's point out that Poland was under martial law, so they did not play any official friendlies before the World Cup. So that was the only opportunity that Peru would have had to scout Poland when they were on tour playing against club teams and I guess representative 11 sides. It was said that Tim only selected players from Lima because he could not stand the altitude. Was this a justified criticism?
Well, it is well founded because that's something that's a behavior that the coach in that time had. But we have to settle this. There are three main teams in Peru, and I'm talking about at the moment, and it was the same back in the day. Alianza Lima, Sporting Cristal, and Universitario de Deportes, these three teams are from Lima. And these three teams were the base of the final roster for Elba de Padua Lima. He picked players from these three teams, along, of course, of the players that were playing abroad. But yeah, that was mainly his base. He was considering that playing in Spain without any kind of altitude was gonna be more keen for the players from Lima. I think that it's one of the reasons why he picked them. As I was mentioning, there were players. We're talking about Ramón Quiroga. We're talking about Rubén Díaz, Franco Navarro. They all played in Lima, and they were part of the starting 11 or the of mostly all of the previous campaign, the qualifier campaign, the friendlies, and finally the World Cup. So yeah, Shahan, yeah, I can assure that he preferred to have players from Lima instead of higher altitude teams. They were not selected at all.
Let's look at the qualification process again. You mentioned they eliminated Uruguay and Colombia. Let's remember that Uruguay had won the 1980-81, the Mundialito. So there was much hype about Uruguay at this point. By now, by qualifying to the World Cup, Peru had qualified for the three of the last four World Cups at this point. Was this regarded as a significant achievement at the time?
It was a very good achievement for the general public and the press and for the public opinion and the general public and the press and all the football fans in Peru. It was good news qualifying twice in a row. Despite of qualifying for the 78 World Cup, remember Peru missed the 74 World Cup. So this was a good achievement, qualifying twice in a row. That's why expectations were very high. Having a very winner coach as Elba de Padua Lima, having a constellation of stars such as Julio César Uribe and Teófilo Cubillas, Franco Navarro, Germán Leguía, Rubén Díaz, the goalkeeper with a lot of experience, Ramón Quiroga. So yeah, the expectations were very high, and despite of qualifying directly for the World Cup, they were expecting also a lot on the European tour and of course on the World Cup.
Julio Cesar Uribe had been the main discovery since the 1978 World Cup. Can you describe his trajectory up to this point?
Julio César Uribe, it's a player that was the captain of Sporting Cristal, one of the most important teams in Peru. Prior to the 1982 World Cup, he had a very significant role in the qualification for the 1982 World Cup. He scored against Colombia. He had a fantastic match against Uruguay here in Lima. He scored also against Uruguay at the Centenario Stadium in Montevideo along Guillermo La Rosa. So he was the Peruvian star at that time. And it was a headache for Elba de Padua Lima because Julio César Uribe had a very similar style of play than Teófilo Cubillas. So it was very complicated to have them two at the same time in the starting 11. So Julio César Uribe was the starter, right? And Teófilo Cubillas was waiting patiently on the bench. By that time, I would like to say that Uribe, despite of playing in Sporting Cristal, he later played in the Italian Calcio. He played in Cagliari. He became an idol and later in Colombia. So this was a very fully functional player. He originally a midfielder, but he knew how to play as a lone striker or accompanying a striker as a second striker and even on the wings of the field. So yeah, he became, I'm gonna risk to say, the most important pillar in the 1982 qualifying and the friendlies and for the World Cup.
And apparently, there was some interest from Leeds United as well at around this
Oh
time.
yeah.
It was reported that Tim had convinced the federation to make the extra effort to include foreign based players. Was this the element that allowed them to qualify, you think?
As I was mentioning on some previous questions, Shahan, the base of the team was the three most important teams from Lima: Sporting Cristal, Alianza Lima, and Universitario de Deportes. Also, they picked some players from the outside. Let's remember that Jose Velasquez, with World Cup experience, was playing in Toronto Blizzard. Teófilo Cubillas, at the end of his career, practically was playing on the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. Percy Rojas was playing in Belgium. Jerónimo Barbadillo was playing in Tigres of Mexico. Juan Carlos Oblitas on Belgium. Guillermo La Rosa on Colombia. The main and the majority of players were part of the domestic tournament. So we were talking about only a handful. We're talking about only six players who were exercising football abroad. So yeah, the main base was from the domestic tournament, and that was Herba de Padua Lima idea. He, of course, did not consider to other players that were playing abroad, maybe because of their age or because they didn't fit the coach idea or style of play. But yeah, that was the main base. Domestic tournament, out of 20 players, 15 were playing in the domestic tournament. So yeah, that was the base.
We already mentioned, yeah, there were many players from the 1978 squad still part of the team. As a result, were they considered an experienced team or were they looked upon as an old team? And was this considered a weakness for the World Cup?
Well, one of the critics towards the team was the inclusion of Ramon Quiroga. Ramon Quiroga, remember that he was part of the 70s World Cup, so it was on the end of its career. The same thing for Teófilo Cubillas, who was playing on the United States, and some people from the press and the media were saying, I mean, is United States a competitive enough league for a player to be who is intending to be in the World Cup? Remember that Cubilla's case after his career in Europe, in Basel, Switzerland, and Porto in Portugal, he returned to Alianza Lima until the 79. And from the 79 to the and to even after the World Cup, he was playing in the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. So yeah, that was one of the critiques, saying that maybe Cubillas wasn't in the best shape and not playing in a competitive league that gave him enough legitimacy to be part of the team. And other players such as Juan Carlos Oblitas, even Ruben Diaz, that had this previous World Cup experience, were in the end of their careers. So yeah, one of the critics would be that Elba de Padua Lima should have picked younger players that were performing well at the domestic tournament instead of these veteran players.
Speaking of veteran players, Hector Chumpitas had actually participated in the qualification process, but at this point, the 38-year-old would miss the World Cup through injury. How was this absence regarded?
Well, remember that Hector Chumpitas, along with Rubén Diaz, were the fullbacks for more than 10 years in Peru's team, right? Back from the World Cups and America Cup, they had a lot of hierarchy, if you want to call it like that. They had a lot of presence. These two players, Rubén Diaz on the left as a left back and Hector Chumpitas on the right back. And you're right, he suffered an injury and he couldn't be part of the rest of the process. And that's why he was replaced by young fullback from Alianza Lima, Salvador Salguero. He took part of the last matches of qualification and the tour, and of course, the World Cup.
To get the release of international players from foreign clubs, television companies had to buy back the players as Peruvian clubs would be unable to. Can you explain this novelty?
Yeah, that wasn't really strange back in the time. You know, the economics of the clubs were not as we can see today with the sponsorship and stuff. And yeah, that actually happened that some, companies were acquiring footballers' rights for their, transfers and even the plane tickets and stuff. And that had to happen because there was a crisis in the Peruvian Football Association. So yeah, that had to happen. Of course, it's not well seen. It implies that there is not a good planification, and of course it can affect, the team both mentally and on the field.
Peru's preparation matches in 1982 were particularly impressive with wins against the likes of France and Hungary. Was there optimism after such results that Peru might be a dark horse at the World Cup?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. It was a lot of optimism. Peru, even before the tour to Europe, they played against Argentina and Brazil teams. Of course, this was favored by Elba de Padua Lima nationality, that he had contacts in Brazil, and they played against Cruzeiro, they played against Palmeiras, they even played against,
Gremio.
yeah, Gremio, Atlético Nacional of Colombia, and even Chile, New York Cosmos. So, yeah, they had a good preparation. The first team that Peru was playing against in the European tour was Fiorentina in the Artemio Franchi Stadium in Florence. So, yeah, Peru won that match with Germán Leguia's goal. They also played another friendly against a mix of players from Inter and Milan, right? Peru won 2-0 with Malasquez and Leguia's goals. They also played against Hungary with a good win for Peru with 2 goals from Julio César Uribe. Another draw against Deportivo La Coruña with Uribe striking again, friendly against Algeria, and of course, this very well known match against France in Parc des Princes in Paris. So, yeah, in my opinion, there was a good preparation, and all these wins and draws were even, increasing the expectations from the Peruvian fans and the press and the public opinion. So, yeah.
And they also defeated Romania 2-0 and Paris Saint-Germain. They defeated Paris Saint-Germain in a
Oh, yeah.
friendly. The match against France, that was in late April, and it was Oblitas's winner near the end. The only strange result was that 5-1 loss to New York Cosmos, but their form was good in all the other matches in this preparation phase. Let's look at the final 22 selected for the World Cup. For goalkeepers, at number one, we have Eusebio Acasuazo of Universitario. Number 12, Jose Gonzalez Ganoza of Alianza Lima. And starting goalkeeper, number 21, Ramon Quiroga from Sporting Cristal, who we discussed last time because of the controversy in the match against Argentina, etc. But he's still Peru's number one at this point. Defenders, number two, Jaime Duarte of Alianza Lima. Number three, Salvador Salguero of Alianza Lima. Number four, Hugo Gastulo of Universitario. Number 13, Oscar Arizaga of Club Atlético Chalaco. Number 14, Miguel Angel Gutierrez of Sporting Cristal. Number 15, Ruben Toribio Diaz of Sporting Cristal. Number 16, Jorge Olachea of Alianza Lima. Midfielders. At number 5, Herman Leguia of Universitario. At number 6, Jose Velasquez of Independiente Medellin of Colombia. And as we mentioned, his contract was owned by the Channel 4 of Lima. Number 8, Cesar Cueto, playing at Nacional Medellin in Colombia. And again, his contract was owned by Channel 5 in Lima. Number 9, Julio Cesar Uribe of Sporting Cristal. Number 10, Teofio Cubillas of Fort Lauderdale Strikers in USA. Number 18, Eduardo Malasquez of Deportivo Municipal. Number 20, Percy Rojas playing in Sereng in Belgium. And number 22, Luis Reina of Sporting Cristal. Strikers. Number 7, Jeronimo Barbadillo of Tigres de la UANL of Monterrey in Mexico. Number 11, Juan Carlos Oblitas playing in Seraing in Belgium. Number 17, Francisco Navarro of Deportivo Municipal. And number 19, Guillermo La Rosa playing in Nacional Medellin in Colombia. And his contract was owned by Channel 5 of Lima. The captain of the team is Ruben Toribio Diaz. And as we mentioned earlier, Cubillas was part of the 1970 and 1978 squads, while Duarte, Leguia, Velasquez, Cueto, Oblitas, Diaz, La Rosa, Rojas, and Quiroga were part of the 1978 team. And from this group, many of them would not see any action during the World Cup. That would be like Acasuso, Gastulo, the goalkeepers, Ganoza, Arizaga, Gutierrez, Navarro, Malasquez, Rojas, and Reina. Reina, of course, would gain fame 3 years later for man marking Diego Maradona in a World Cup qualifier. Following the 1978 performances, I imagine the Peruvian press at least expected the team to reach the second round.
Yeah, of course. And having this team, even though having the majority of the players in the domestic tournament, but, with a good role in the qualification on the friendlies, the expectations were very high. They were expecting to, at least a win against Cameroon and maybe a draw against Italy that happened at the end. And of course, a good result, maybe a draw or a win against Poland. But yeah, the expectations were high with this team, but unfortunately, the results were not as good.
Peru started this World Cup on June 15th. They're in Group A with the teams that you mentioned. They face off against Cameroon on June 15th at La Coruña at Estadio Riazor. So for this match, we have the following lineup: Quiroga, Duarte, Diaz, captain of the team, Salguero, Olachea, Cueto, Velasquez, Cubillas, he'd be replaced by La Rosa in the 57th minute. Leguia, he'd be replaced by Barbadillo in the 57th minute. Oblitas and Uribe. The match would end as a scoreless tie, though Cameroon did score a goal in the 34th minute through Roger Mia, but that was ruled out due to offside. And it must be said, during this match, at one point, a dog had entered the pitch, but no one noticed. The match ended as a disappointing tie for Peru. So, what was the press reaction at home after this unimpressive match against an opponent that many felt Peru should defeat comfortably?
Huge disappointment because even though they were comfortable, let's say, with or agreeing with the first, the 11 presented by Elba de Padua Lima, with Teófilo Cubillas, Germán Leguía, and Juan Carlos Oblitas as the three players as strikers and Julio César Uribe floating in the midfield. They considered that it could be less conservative, let's say. African teams seem to be very physical, but lack of technique in this case. Even though Roger Milla is a fantastic player, along with Jan Onana and the goalkeeper Tomás Encono, who had a fantastic afternoon. The public opinion were concerned about the coach attitude towards this game. And I want to mention that Franco Navarro, the striker from Deportivo Municipal, had a fantastic previous campaign qualification and on the friendlies, and he was not even considered as a substitute. Guillermo La Rosa and Jerónimo Barbadillo, both of the strikers, entered in the match replacing Teófilo Cubillas and Germán Leguía, and one of the critics were why not having or Percy Rojas or Franco Navarro or Eduardo Malásquez, players who can dribble and can maybe change the pace of the game. They were not considered for this match. So yeah, that was one of the main critics. And after this first match, it was completely settled down and there was a major proof that Julio César Uribe and Teófilo Cubillas couldn't play together. It had to be one of those two in the starter 11. And That was another critic, along with the substitute options made by the coach.
So their next match is on June 18th at Vigo at Estadio Balaidos against Italy. Let's remember Italy would win this World Cup in the end. But at this point, they're still not at their best form. So this is an Italy with the likes of Dino Zoff, Cabrini, Scirea, Bruno Conti, Tardelli, Paolo Rossi, all the stars that we know. Now for Peru, we have the following lineup: Quiroga, Duarte, Diaz, captain of the team, Salguero, Olachea, Barbadillo. He'd be replaced by Leguia in the 51st minute. Cueto, Velasquez, Cubillas, Oblitas, Uribe, and he'd be replaced by La Rosa in the 65th minute. Now, in this match, Italy would take the lead in the 19th minute. So on the left side, Antonioni passed across to Bruno Conti, who scored with a long range shot from outside of the box. Peru would have to wait until the last 5 minutes to get the equalizer. There was a free kick on the right side. Cubillas passed across to the middle. Ruben Diaz shot from outside the box, and the ball deflected off of Colovati into the net. Fulvio Colovati, the Italian defender. So, in some sources, this goal is credited to Diaz. In other sources, I've seen it to be credited as an own goal to Colovati. But in any case, the match ended as a 1-1 tie, and perhaps it was a satisfactory result against a good team. Italy had dominated the first half hour. Peru also had a penalty kick appeal. Like in the 65th minute, Gentile fouled Oblitas, but nothing came out of that. Afterwards, Tim felt that his strikers, Uribe and Oblitas, were below par. There was also an incident in this match where at one point Velasquez collided with the referee. Tim was still confident that they could still qualify, but already the task is difficult.
That is right. There are only 2 points with this second draw against Italy, even though Italy was dominating for the most part of the game. Peru were safe, displaying a good defensive side. We're talking about nothing less than Paolo Rossi and Francesco Graziani on the attacking side of Italy were well contained by Jaime Duarte, Ruben Diaz, and Rafael Salguero in the defensive side of Peru. And there's the criticism once again, Shahan. Julio Cesar Uribe and Teófilo Cubillas playing together once again, even though the first match was more of an evidence that they couldn't play together. Elba de Padua team decided to place these two players again, and it was also criticized again by his pick of substitutes. Germán Leguía wasn't a starter, but he replaced, Jerónimo Barbadillo, and Guillermo La Rosa replaced Julio César Uribe. And, the media and the press here were actually expecting that Teófilo Cubillas was the one being changed, not Uribe. And maybe having some of the youth of Franco Navarro or Percy Rojas or Eduardo Malásquez to change, the attacking idea. But of course, that didn't happen. And there was the second draw, 2 points out of six, and they were waiting for the third match against Poland, and it was, even prior to the game, a very difficult thing to access.
Yes, this last match in the group was on June 22nd at La Coruña at Estadio Riazor. And let's remember, this is a Poland team that finished third in 1974, that in fact faced Peru in the 1978 World Cup. They won 1-0 in the second group phase. Familiar names like Zbigniew Boniek, a global star at this point, Gersgors Lato, Janusz Kupchevich, Vladislav Zmuda, a lot of big names of that era. So definitely it was not an easy task to play against Poland at this point. For this match, we have the following lineup: Quiroga, Duarte, Diaz, captain of the team, Salguero, Olachea, Velasquez, Cubillas. He'd be replaced by Barbadillo in the 50th minute. Cueto, La Rosa, Oblitas. He'd be replaced by Uribe in the 50th minute. and Leguia. Perhaps these double substitutions in the 50th minute had absolutely the wrong effect, as the deluge started right after that. The match was scoreless in the first half, and perhaps sensing elimination, that's when team made the double substitution. But what happens is something unexpected, as the goals just came after that. Well, the four of the goals were like in a 15-minute spell. So in the 55th minute, Smolarek opened the scoring for Poland. 3 minutes later, Lato scored Poland's second. Quiroga had come out way out of his box, and Lato just pushed the ball under him on the ground level into the net. 61st minute, 3 minutes later, that's when Zbigniew Boniek scored his goal. So that's 3-0 after an hour. In fact, after the result was more or less guaranteed, Boniek was shifted back into midfield. 69th minute, Bunkol scored Poland's fourth. 76th minute, the Polish substitute Ciolek scored Poland's fifth. And Peru pulled the goal back in the 83rd minute when La Rosa scored Peru's consolation goal. The adventure was over in the most disastrous way possible. So, how did Peru implode against Poland? Was it exhaustion?
It was a loss very hard to digest because, as you was mentioned, the first half was very neutral. Both had chances, both teams had possibilities, but I think it became a very physical second match, and that was one of Peru's weaknesses. Even back in the friendlies, we would see that Peru in the last 15, 20, 25 minutes were completely exhausted, lack of legs, and that's because most of the players were in a domestic tournament, right? And the players that were in foreign leagues were already experienced, let's say, if we don't want to talk about age. And in the other side, you had Poland with a great presence, with a great moment, with Lato, with Smolarek, with Boniek, and the other players you mentioned with fantastic times in Europe. So I think that was the breaking point in that match. Of course, the critics were mentioning that Elba de Padua Lima team waited until the third and last match on that phase to finally seat one of those two, Cubillas or Julio César Uribe. He decided to give Cubillas his confidence as a starter, but that didn't turn out well. Despite of being such a physical match and in the need of actually including more players in the midfield side, such as Luis Reina or Eduardo Malásquez, to try to compensate or in some way neutralize Smolarek and Boniek, he decided with two forwards, right? So that didn't turn out well, and as you was mentioning, in a spree of 15 minutes, they received three goals, and the morale was very low. And if they score you three goals, three more can come. That's how football works, right? It was a 5-1 at the end, and that meant also the end of the Peruvian quest in the 1982 World Cup.
Later, Uribe felt that he was the most marked up player, even more than Zico and Maradona.
Mhm.
Now, was the average age of a team brought up as an excuse for the loss?
Well, as I was mentioning before, we can talk about age, but I think that it's wiser than talk about hierarchy in this case. We're talking about players that were in a domestic tournament, where sometimes teams weren't able to fly to other provinces because logistic problems. And I think that nowhere in the world, Shahan, and you can agree with me here, that you need television enterprises to buy, players, contracts. So that happened here. Despite of having maybe an outside vision that Peru's association and Peru national team was working well, things weren't good in the intern. there was a big fight, and this is well founded. Of course, there are no newspaper scraps, but this was more of a boys to boys gossip between Julio César Uribe and Teófilo Cubillas because of the leadership inside the team. Julio César Uribe had more, leadership with some players from the domestic tournament, and Teófilo Cubillas had, all these foreign players and the ones that he, played with in the previous World Cup, such as Velázquez, such as Rubén Díaz, such as Ramón Quiroga. So the team, the intern of the team, the dressing room, if you want to call it that way, was broken. So nothing good can come against that. And I think that, of course, a lot of responsibility here it gotta be taken by the coach. He had plenty of time for the preparation. We can't deny that there were very good performances in the friendlies before the World Cup, but planning the games against Cameroon and then Italy, it was more of an anticipation what would come next against Poland, and it was tragic. Of course, it was tragic. No one was expecting, such a disastrous ending for Peru, but that's football.
And perhaps the team had peaked maybe too soon in the qualifiers and the spring friendlies before the World Cup.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it can be tricky. You are playing against Colombia and Uruguay, South American superpowers in that time, and that maybe gave the team a false confidence, and maybe a false, sense or feeling of greatness when you have to dispute each World Cup game with, as they say here in Peru and in South America, with the knife in your teeth. You don't have to play the game, you have to fight the games. That didn't happen with Cameroon. Probably if the story was different and with points on the first game and a draw against Italy, Peru would probably be qualified, but that didn't happen. And that, of course, after the 82 World Cup, 36 years had to pass to have Peru again in a World Cup. So it was a breaking point for sure.
Of course, the press has to find people to place the blame on. So I imagine Tim would have been criticized the manager, but what players would have been regarded as the scapegoats?
Well, in this case, of course, Cubillas and Julio César Uribe, it was not a mystery that they were,
At odds with one another, yeah.
yeah, of course. People were complaining that Cubillas had responsibility on the Argentina 6-0 back in the 78, so the team was actually used to play without Cubillas on the tour and did very well. Cubillas was playing in the United States in the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. At the end of its career, it was, of course, a huge fight against Julio César Uribe because of the leadership. But yeah, those were the two main scapegoats. Julio César Uribe, the fight against Cubillas, and the inclusion of players who were on the last side of their career, such as Rubén Díaz and Ramón Quiroga.
Was it self-evident that this Peru generation was at its end and would struggle in the following decades? Or was there still this belief that Peru were now regular qualifiers and they would pass this minor setback?
There was actually two ends of the coin here. One part of the public opinion would be optimistic and say, Franco Navarro and Julio César Uribe are young players. We have to look for more young players in the domestic tournaments so they can show their game and maybe play abroad. But there were other people, including the press, a very big side of the press, that were saying, okay, this is done for Peru. The golden age has finished. There were two World Cups nailed simultaneously. So for the World Cup qualifiers for the 86 was disastrous. There was no aim, there was no goal for Peruvian team. So Julio Cesar Uribe had the chance, to get the team on his back, but unfortunately that didn't happen. So yeah, as I was mentioning earlier, there were 36 years, 36 long years without a World Cup participation for Peru.
Teofilo Cubillas, perhaps Peru's greatest ever player, ended this World Cup in such a disappointing way. And you already mentioned the reasons, whether it's age, whether it's the league he's playing in. Did he, because of his legacy, gain back his image in the succeeding years and decades?
Well, probably because he returned to Peru even prior than he was playing in the United States. He was playing for Alianza Lima. He's one of Alianza Lima's idols. But yeah, it's a thorn that can't get rid of Teófilo Cubillas, unfortunately. He gave us a lot of, joy with the World Cup's participation, but even though he has never mentioned it, I think it's no mystery that this beef he had with Julio Cesar Uribe were contaminating all of the team's mindset. Of course, we can look back, but we cannot change the past. But there's always going to be the what if question, right? But yeah, I think that Cubillas has had a brilliant career both in clubs and with Peru, and it would be maybe unfair to judge him because of one World Cup. But yeah, that's on the media and that's on the public opinion for sure.
In closing, how is this World Cup viewed by Peruvian football historians, given the team's good performances pre World Cup? And is it looked upon as a reference point for the team's decline?
Yeah, there are many authors, such as Jose Carlos Irigoyen. He has this book called Against Everything, and he was evaluating and analyzing this dispute for the conductor side from the team between Julio Cesar Uribe and Teófilo Cubillas. He analyzes this situation and, diagnosed that it was one of the most, or maybe the main issue for the Peruvian team, even prior to the World Cup 1982. Because, Cubillas only participated in the friendlies that were playing in Lima, right? Against other teams that were not as important as the ones played in the friendlies in Europe, even though, and this happened here in Lima against Romania, Cubillas was booed by the fans, was booed and was insulted and getting thrown objects by the Peruvian fans. So the team was divided not only on the inside, but also on the outside. The crowd and the fans were not agreeing with the coach decision to include Cubillas because of his age and because he was shadowing in some case Julio Cesar Uribe, who was meant to be the conductor of the Peru's 1982 team. And unfortunately, the results were there, and that's it. That was the mindset of the media and the crowd, and unfortunately, it had to finish like that.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information is listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Danielle, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Of course, Shahan, thank you very much again for the opportunity, for your valuable time, and your audience valuable time as well. And yeah, looking forward to talk to you again in the future. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you.